Good evening and welcome to the Worldwide End Time Radio Podcast. I'm your host, Brian DeLore, and I thank you all for tuning into the program today. And on this program, I'm going to be addressing the criticisms of the book of Daniel. The liberal scholars attacked the book of Daniel and attempt to discredit it on several key points. And so I want to address those today, and I want to refute what the liberal scholars are saying about the book of Daniel. And let me put it this way. I have gone to the website spiritandtruth.org for this information. I have been searching for several days. I have read many things concerning this subject, and it's been very difficult to try and put it all together and condense it and put it into a program. I mean, the amount of information concerning this subject is just unbelievable. And it's written by many scholarly individuals, and it's just hard to absorb and then put out in just a short period of time, because they throw so much at you in terms of the evidence in support of the authenticity of Daniel and in refuting the views of the critics that, you're talking hundreds of pages. And I needed to find something that would just sort of condense it and boil it down to just a couple of key points on each issue, and that way I could put it out there. It would be much easier for me to do that way, because first of all, I just don't have the time to invest in that type of research. I just don't have it. And so I went to this website. I happened upon it, spiritandtruth.org, and that is the website that really helped me to put this all together, and now I'm going to disseminate it out to my listeners, and hopefully I'll do a good job. And so this person, the title of the article is The Date and Authorship of the Book of Daniel, and it was written in 2008 by Charles Ray, Bible teacher, Coppell, Texas. Okay, and that again is from spiritandtruth.org. And he writes this, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. He says it's no accident that the three most attacked books in the Bible are the most significant: Genesis, Daniel, and Revelation. It is commonly known that if the foundation is faulty, the building will soon fall. This article will seek to refute the view that the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, as many liberal scholars claim, and thus could not have been written by Daniel. This being the case, the issue of the date of Daniel will be addressed first. Miller concisely states the importance of this study. One's view concerning authorship and date is significant because it ultimately determines the interpretation of every aspect of this prophecy. And so that's it in a nutshell. The reason I'm doing this program is to help train and educate the body of Christ to be able to take what they learn from this program and elsewhere and then disseminate what they've learned to unbelievers. There are unbelievers who are going to have questions. There are unbelievers who have actually become very familiar with a lot of these liberal scholars' attacks on the book of Daniel. And if you are like me, and you like to use the book of Daniel as a reference during your witnessing, and you somehow have one of these people you're witnessing to begin to throw curveball questions at you, and you don't know the answer, well, your witness is obviously going to be diminished or totally ineffective. So I like to keep people informed. I like to be informed. So when I address people, you'd be surprised at the stuff that comes up. And if you don't know what you're talking about, people really tend to think less of you. They put less trust and confidence in what you're saying to them. And so, you have to, we're all at different levels, and but I believe it's best to be as informed as you can, and that's why the Bible tells us, the book of 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, study to show yourself approved unto God, workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So that is why I'm doing this program, because I want to educate you and inform you, so you in turn can go out and witness to others and be an effective witness for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay, now my computer just turned off. Okay, back on. All right, so the date of Daniel is the first point where critics attack and attempt to discredit the book of Daniel. And part of understanding this is found in the position of Daniel in the Hebrew canon. And I'm going to read from this directly. I think I can do a better job that way. One of the arguments put forth, which seems to indicate a late date or a 2nd century BC date for Daniel, is its place in the canon. Now, you must understand, and for those of you who don't understand, most liberal scholars who attempt to discredit the book of Daniel place the time of its writing during sometime in the 2nd century BC and during the Maccabean revolt. Many of the things that Daniel prophesies seems to kind of fit a little bit with the things that were happening at that time. Really, it doesn't, but it appears that way on the surface. And so the critics will attempt to use this as a way to discredit Daniel. And Daniel, again, was written in the 6th century BC, and the internal evidence of Daniel proves this, but let me address this first, and then I'll get back to the other. It says that a late date for 2nd century for Daniel is its place in the canon. English versions of the Bible are based on the canonical order given in the Septuagint. As such, Daniel is grouped with 3 major writing prophets. In the Hebrew canon, however, the book is positioned with the writings. Let me reread that. English versions of the Bible are based on the canonical order given in the Septuagint. As such, Daniel is grouped with the 3 major writing prophets. In the Hebrew canon, however, the book is positioned with the writings Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Lamentations. Critics believe that since the writings were collected after the prophetic canon was closed, Daniel could not have been written in the 6th century. The critics' assumption is wrong. A number of the Psalms and Proverbs were composed between 1020 and 950 BC. The events in the book of Job likely happened in the days of Abraham, which is 2000 BC. Therefore, finding Daniel among the writings does not require a late date. The Masoretes, AD 750 to 950, may have moved Daniel from the prophets to the writings, since much of the book is history, and Daniel was not a commissioned prophet to a certain people. Now, that is their belief, and that is their refutation of the critics' criticisms of Daniel and attempts to discredit Daniel by attempting to assign a different date to it other than what is given in the internal context of Daniel itself. Then we have Ben Sira. And many critics say that Ben Sira, who was a writer back in Old Testament times, he did not mention Daniel. And a passage in this apocryphal work written about 195 BC lists some notable Old Testament figures, but Daniel is not one of them. However, arguments from silence are generally considered weak. 2, the passage in question, 44 verse 1, does not list Ezra or Mordecai either, among others. Some critics conclude that the author didn't know about Daniel, which is nearly impossible to believe, thus forcing a late date. Other evidence indicates Daniel was actually well known by the 2nd century. 1 Maccabees, chapter 2, verse 59, and Baruch, chapter 1, verse 15, and chapter 3, verse 3, both allude to Daniel and his book. Now, keep in mind a lot of these writings I'm referring to, I'm not even familiar with them, and so I'm just reading what they have written here. You can, if you want some Bible study to do, I would suggest that you look these up. I'm going to look them up later when I have the time and see what is actually written there. But suffice it to say for now that these books indicate that Daniel was indeed written in the 6th century BC. Furthermore, many fragments of Daniel were found at Qumran. If you don't know what Qumran is, it's a cave. There were several caves located over by the Dead Sea, and I believe it was 1947. Some little boy was walking down there with his dog, and he threw a rock into one of these caves, and he heard something break, and so he went into the cave, one of the caves at Qumran, and he found all these tablets on which all these writings were made, and most of the writings from the book of Daniel were found there. And this was in 1947, and it says that because these fragments were found, it was implied that the book was of some importance by the 3rd century. It appears Ben Sira's list was selective and not exhaustive. So there again, all of these things once again add up to the critics being wrong about the about the dating of Daniel. Okay, then we have the historical considerations. Third, critics insist there are historical blunders in Daniel. They make that conclusion based on the assumption that a 6th century author could not have known such detail about the pre-Greek era. The critics simply reason that the historical parts are inaccurate, but that doesn't bother them because such errors do not affect the religious teachings of the book. Since the book fits the historical setting of the 6th century better than it does the setting of the 2nd century, the argument actually points. Let me see. If the book were composed during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, during the 2nd century, which was about the time of the Maccabean revolt, one would expect more details from that time period. 2, it is not strange that Daniel does not mention. Is it not strange, rather, that Daniel does not mention such heroes as Matthias or Judas Maccabeus? Liberals are also called on the carpet also because they seem to overlook the relationship between the man Daniel and the current administration, whether Babylonian or Persian. Nebuchadnezzar and Darius both appeared to have even respected Daniel. This was definitely not the case with Antiochus. He was killing as many godly Jews as he could lay his hands on. The 2nd century Jews despised Antiochus IV. Even if the stories were written earlier than the 2nd century BC and adapted by a Maccabean author, it seems logical to expect that he would have changed elements of the stories to fit his present situation. Another source of debate is the use of the word Chaldean in the book of Daniel. In some instances, It is used to describe a race of people, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king. Yet in other verses, it is used to describe a group of wise men. The Chaldeans answered the king. Critics charge that the 6th century is too early for that word to have developed into a term that refers to a certain group of men. Herodotus, the Greek historian, may offer an explanation. In some of his writings, he refers to the Chaldeans in such a way as to imply that they were speedily put into all the politically strategic offices of Babylonia as soon as they had gained control of the capital. If this is the case, then Chaldean may have early come into use as a term for the priest of Bel-Marduk. Okay, so again, another point on which the critics are proven wrong. And in terms of the language, again, they attack Daniel on the language itself. Fourth, it has been noticed that the book of Daniel has at least a few words from 4 different languages. Persian, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic are all represented. Critics claim this mixture is proof of a late date. However, the weight of the linguistic evidence suggests an early date. A few words are Persian in origin. This fact should not be surprising. During the last few years of his life, Daniel served in the Persian government. Approximately half of the 20 Persian loanwords found concern government officials in some way. In the entire book of Daniel, only 3 words are of Greek origin. Liberal scholars advocate the idea that since Alexander the Great did not spread the Greek language until the 4th century, Daniel could not have been written in the 6th century. All 3 words are musical instruments. Chapter 3, verse 5, 7, 10, and 15. The word liar, I guess that's how you pronounce it, L-Y-R-E, in the New American Standard Bible is pronounced zither, is a translation of the Greek kitharis, a term found in the Iliad and the Odyssey in the 8th century BC. The other 2 Greek words, the psalterion or psaltery, and harp, and symphonia, which refers to a bagpipe, and they say bagpipe in the NIV. It is true that they are not known in any Greek literature until the 6th century. Other factors must be considered, however. Simply because a word was not written in a certain language at a particular time does not mean the word did not exist. It is an argument from silence. These are not everyday conversation words, and thus it would be expected that they would be rarely encountered. It is not wise to take a stand on the date of a biblical book based on only 2 or 3 words. Greek merchants were trading with the Near East as early as the 7th century. If Daniel had been composed in the 2nd century, one would expect to see many words in Greek, the language of the day. For example, the terms for government officials are in Persian, as noted above, and not in Greek. Therefore, it is not terribly surprising to find Greek words in Daniel. A distinctive feature of the book of Daniel is that just over half of it is written in Aramaic. For a time, scholars promoted the belief that the Aramaic was Western Aramaic, and thus reasoned that the book was compiled in Israel. Further research, however, has discredited this conclusion. Archer, he's another commentator. Archer shows that the Aramaic was known throughout the Near East. Finally, the Aramaic of Daniel more closely resembles that of the 5th century documents, such as the Elephantine Papyri, than it does of the later writings, such as the Genesis Apocryphon, 1st century. Surprisingly, less than half of Daniel was written in Hebrew. Much that was said about Aramaic applies to the Hebrew language as well. Critics claim the Hebrew of Daniel is not as smooth as that of what would be expected for the 6th century, Judaism. It is likely the Hebrew was updated during the centuries of its existence, spellings, names of places, etc., yet no term in it precludes Daniel as a human author. Two other considerations are in order. First, the Hebrew portion contains words, phrases, and grammar common throughout the Hebrew Bible. Second, these words and phrases are very much like those found in Ezekiel, Haggai, Ezra, and Chronicles, and not so much like the Qumran documents. Okay, so that again is another point on which the critics have been proven wrong. And then we have the theology. Those who hold to a later date for the book of Daniel also look to theology to support their claim. Second century advocates have the notion that the areas of angelology, Christology, and the resurrection and judgment are too far developed to be a product of the 6th century. Daniel is unique in that it provides the name of certain angels, Gabriel and Michael, yet otherwise it contributes nothing new to the study of angels. These messengers of God are encountered in several Old Testament books, even as far back as Genesis. It is wrong to state or imply that the doctrine of Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, was not begun until the book of Daniel was written. Genesis 3:15 has the first hint of a Messiah. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Furthermore, Isaiah, written in 740 to 680, has numerous passages which speak of a Messiah. Concerning the resurrection and judgment, again, passages older than Daniel mention these concepts. Job 19:25-27, Isaiah 26:19, Psalm 49:15, and Hosea 13:14, among others, speak about a resurrection. Isaiah 26:19 in particular declares, "Your dead will live, their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy, for your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits." Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10, and Judges 11:27, all of which were composed before Daniel have something to say about God's judgment. Genesis 18:25 calls for the judge, God, the judge of all the earth. Many other passages could be rehearsed. In summary, none of the doctrines presented in Daniel is without precedent. Arguments based on the book's theology are weak at best, except for eschatology. The book of Daniel makes no significant contribution to theology. Predictive prophecy. So again, the previous was another point on which the critics have been soundly refuted. Now we come to predictive prophecy. The Bible student's view of prophecy will influence his decision on the date of Daniel. Those who believe that scriptures contain predictive prophecy usually choose an earlier date for the book. Those who don't believe this assign Daniel to the Maccabean period. Actually, this conclusion doesn't make sense. Even if a person didn't think Daniel was able to prophesy, the Greek and Roman empires has some explaining to do, because there is predictive prophecy in the book. Daniel chapter 9:25, verse 26, speak of a Messiah who would not be born for hundreds of years, or more than 150 years, according to the 2nd century daters. The critics' explanation? Most verses in Daniel are not to be taken literally. It is true that Antiochus is a part of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 11, verse 21 through 35, which is not surprising, since that was a very significant time in Israel's history. This fact raises a question of note. What would be the point of revealing to someone in the 6th century Babylon a detailed account of the history of 2nd century? With all the predictive prophecies, these revelations serve a number of purposes. They demonstrate the Lord's sovereignty. They bring hope to a people in distress by revealing a favorable future. They exhibit the power and inerrancy of the Bible. The doctrine of the resurrection, chapter 12, verses 2 and 13, would have comforted the aged prophet as well as believers who face death, etc. That is why it is not so far-fetched to accept the idea that Daniel received a great deal of information while living in 6th century Babylon. Okay, and I just mentioned this a few minutes ago, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The several manuscripts of Daniel were found at Qumran and K4Q, I guess that's what that means. So let me read this again. Several manuscripts of Daniel were found at Qumran, and 4Q Daniel is of particular interest. Just about everyone agrees it dates to the 2nd century BC. If that is true, and it is in all probability, then that piece of information actually supports the concept that Daniel was written in the 6th century, or at least some amount of time before the 2nd century. Whence cometh this conclusion? A document originally composed in the 2nd century would not have been accepted by the Qumran community in such a short amount of time. Harrison writes that there would have been sufficient time for the Maccabean compositions to be circulated, venerated, and accepted as canonical scripture by a Maccabean sect. Similar theories have been applied to Ecclesiastes and some of the Psalms. It was once again believed that they were produced in the 2nd century, but the Qumran evidence showed otherwise. Again, support for a 2nd century date for Daniel is very suspect. Okay, once again, the critics' point has been refuted. The Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures put together in Alexandria, Egypt. When it was written is a matter of debate. Yet the time period can be narrowed to some extent. It appeared to be no earlier than about 300 BC and no later than 100 BC. Other literature from that period suggests the Septuagint came out no later than 132 BC. Even if that date is off by 50 years, it still means Daniel was written much earlier. It should be noted as well that 4 Persian words in Daniel were drastically mistranslated by the Septuagint authors. This indicates their meaning had been long forgotten. If the book was composed in the 2nd century, how is it that the definition of those words had already been lost? Good point. So here again, the critics' point has once again been refuted. The traditions of the church, the synagogue, and the traditions of the church, the synagogue, and other ancient documents. For almost 2,400 years, the synagogue and later the church have taught that the book of Daniel was written by the person so named and that it was accurate on every count, historically, spiritually, etc. It has only been recently when these conclusions were challenged. Such a universal consensus in the church and Jewish community would seem unlikely if it were not true. A handful of Jewish apocryphal works appear to uphold this centuries-old understanding. In 1 Maccabees, chapter 2, verse 59 and 60, Matthias, on his deathbed, seeks to inspire his sons by recalling 2 events in Daniel: the 3 friends in the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the lion's den. 1 Maccabees could have been written as late as 100 BC, yet the fact that the scenes of Daniel were so well known suggests that the book was composed much earlier. Concerning other apocryphal works, Harrison writes, if the pseudepigraphic material designated 1 Enoch borrowed from Daniel, compare 1 Enoch chapter 14 verses 18 through 22 with Daniel chapter 7 verse 9-10, the section involved, which was probably written prior to 150 BC, would testify to the use of Daniel as authoritative scripture at that time. Okay, again, another point well made. Daniel and Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel mentions Daniel 3 times in chapter 14, verse 14, chapter 20, and chapter 20 and chapter 28, verse 3. Whether or not this is our Daniel will be discussed below. For now, it is assumed that the question then becomes, when was the book of Daniel written? Most scholars would say it was written after 593 BC. Thus, it was not... I misspoke. The question then becomes, when was the book of Ezekiel written? Most scholars would say it was written after 593 BC. Thus, it is not far-fetched to believe the book of Daniel was composed in the 6th century. And then, of course, we come to the authorship of Daniel. Within the book of Daniel, the issues of date and authorship are so intertwined that if you are convinced of one, you have found the other. Some scholars don't completely agree with that statement, such as Gonigay. He admits that the chapters manifest a generally consistent viewpoint, though this need not suggest common authorship. He later writes diversity of authorship might be one of the reasons for diversity of language. Golnegay lists these as possible authors: a group of Jewish priests, and he says this is because of the book's concern for Jews and their Messiah, the group of intellectuals brought to Babylon from Jerusalem, or a group of related to the intellectuals. Many liberal scholars believe the author was a descendant of the latter group, a 2nd century Jew who was a member of the Hasidim and wrote using Daniel's name. Porphyry, a 2nd century Neoplatonist, was the first to challenge the traditional view, which held that Daniel was of the 6th century, wrote the book named after him. Porphyry in his writings directly stated that the book was composed in the 2nd century and could not be a product of Daniel. Claims of the book itself. One of the most obvious and powerful arguments in favor of Daniel being the author is the fact that the book itself reports that it was composed by a Daniel. The following verses contain either me, Daniel, or I, Daniel. And that's chapter 7, verse 28, chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 8, verse 1, verse 15, chapter 9, verse 2, and chapter 10, verse 2, and chapter 12, verse 5. Other passages strongly suggest Daniel is the author. Indeed, it is ridiculous to utilize a fraudulent work to teach religious or moral values. Some people are bothered by the fact that the first half of the book is written in the third person. Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. Yet the second half is written in the first person. As for me, Daniel, such a shift in style was rather common in antiquity. Certainly, this cannot be used to support the idea that more than one author was involved, because the name Daniel is solidly linked with me or I. And the last point is the historical accuracy of the book also confirms that it is more likely that the work was compiled in the 6th century and not in the 2nd century. 2 examples will be given. One has to do with the very first verse. Daniel 1:1 declares, "In the 3rd year of the king of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." This appears to contradict Jeremiah 46:2. To Egypt concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the Euphrates river at Carchemish, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. That's written in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 46, verse 2. Nebuchadnezzar invaded both Carchemish and Jerusalem in the same year, 605 BC. Yet Jeremiah makes it clear that 605 was Jehoiakim's 4th year, whereas Daniel says it was Jehoiakim's 3rd year. The difference has been to do with the methods Jeremiah and Daniel employed in counting the number of years a king had been reigning. Jeremiah dated a king's reign using the Judean system. That method considered the accession year to be the 1st year of the reign. Thus, Jehoiakim was appointed king in 608 by Pharaoh Necho. 605 would have been his 4th year. Daniel used the Babylonian system, of course, which did not count a king's 1st year until the beginning of the next calendar year. Therefore, the beginning of Jehoiakim's 1st year would not start until the next calendar year. A second example concerns the identification of Babylon's last king. Was it Nabonidus or Belshazzar? For many years, scholars were of the opinion that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, and that for many years... I lost my place. For many years, scholars were of the opinion that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, and that Belshazzar was a legendary figure. Not even Herodotus, among the ancient historians, mentions him. However, more recent archaeological evidence shows that Belshazzar served as co-regent with his father Nabonidus during the last few years of the Babylonian Empire. An inscription found at Ur contains a prayer for a Belshazzar. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Suffice to say, it's speaking of Belshazzar. And it was a prayer offered only to monarchs. Still, other cuneiform documents record how Belshazzar presented sheep and oxen at the temples of Sapphire as an offering of the king. Moreover, Belshazzar bestowed upon Daniel the 3rd, not the 2nd, most authoritative position in the empire. The truth is, Nabonidus was not in Babylon at the time of Cyrus' invasion. He was in North Arabia, where he was killed about the same time as the invasion. Thus Belshazzar was the last king. Since this name has been forgotten by the time of Herodotus, the author of Daniel had to have written much earlier than that. Certainly a 2nd century author would have no knowledge of Belshazzar. And that is the final point I am going to make in refuting the critics' attempts to discredit Daniel. I believe that everything I've just shared with you is historically accurate and verified. And again, you can go to the website spiritandtruth.org, and they have some other things here at the very end of this that may help you. But I've shared as much as I can. I don't have much time left in the program. So I hope this has helped you. And remember, as I said to you at the beginning of the program, I oftentimes use the book of Daniel as a tool for witnessing, because many of the prophecies in there have been fulfilled exactly as as they were predicted by Daniel, and so this again adds further credibility and the preponderance of to the book of Daniel, and the preponderance of the evidence is that the book of Daniel is indeed an inspired book of the Bible. And of course, last but not least is Jesus' endorsement of Daniel. Jesus mentions the abomination spoken of Daniel the prophet, and he mentions that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. So if Jesus believed that Daniel was a prophet, I think you can take that as that's what seals the deal for me. In other words, that Jesus endorsed Daniel, and that tells me that the critics' attempts to discredit Daniel are based on their own personal bias. They don't want Daniel to be true because of its supernatural implications, and so they do their best, the best that they can, to discredit the book. And as far as I am concerned, these critics have not succeeded. And with that, I'm going to close out the program. I hope this message has been a blessing to you. I know it's been rather lengthy, but I needed to go through that in order to show you what the critics are attempting to do and the points they use to try to discredit Daniel. Now, armed with that information, you can go out and witness to somebody else, and if they should happen to throw one of these questions at you, you have the answer. If necessary, download the program, and you can refer back to the program to provide you with the answers necessary to answer those who are have questions, or those who are attempting to discredit the Bible or the book of Daniel. You can use these points I've made in the last half an hour to do just that. Okay, you all are aware of my websites, AmericanChristianRadio.org, WorldwideEndTimeRadio.com, EndTimeRuralNews.com, and EndTimeNewsReport.com. You can go to all those sites. You can go to the links page. At the top of the links page, you have a GoFundMe link, and you can push that if you want to donate to this ministry. A donation of any size would be greatly appreciated. And as always, until the next time, I leave you with this reminder to keep the faith and defend the truth. Have a good night, everybody.